top story is from the Horn of Africa. The dispute over Somalia's breakaway region, Somaliland, is getting bigger, and America seems split about its stance. The result, a mixed signal over a very sensitive map that has grabbed the headlines. Israel has become the first country to recognize Somaliland. In an interview, Donald Trump opposed the move, referring to Somaliland as a region nobody even knows.
Imagine waking up one morning and suddenly your country is recognized as independent for the very first time ever. But instead of the celebration across the world, it sparks anger, outrage, and warnings of instability.
Signing now, as we speak, Israel's official recognition of Somaliland.
The moment did not arrive with fanfare. There was no televised ceremony, no dramatic handshake broadcast across global networks. Instead, the confirmation emerged through coordinated diplomatic notes, carefully worded statements, and a recalibration of language that signaled something profound had changed. Israel had officially recognized Somaliland. For years, Somaliland had existed in a diplomatic gray zone. Functioning institutions, stable borders, and a record of internal governance set it apart from many contested regions, yet formal recognition remained elusive. Most countries treated it cautiously, balancing geopolitical sensitivities against realities on the ground. That balance shifted the instant Israel acted. The reaction in Washington was immediate but confused. The United States had long positioned itself as a central broker in Middle Eastern and African diplomacy. Recognition decisions of this magnitude were typically preceded by consultations, alignments, and strategic signaling. This time, the move landed without warning, the assumption that such a decision would pass through American influence proved incorrect. Israel's decision carried layers of meaning. On the surface, it was a diplomatic recognition of a self-governing entity with defined borders and long-standing administrative control. Beneath that, it reflected a broader recalibration of strategic partnerships across the Red Sea corridor. Trade routes, security cooperation, and maritime access converged in this narrow but vital region. Somaliland's geography mattered. Positioned along critical shipping lanes connecting the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, the territory offered logistical and strategic advantages. Ports that had quietly expanded now gained diplomatic relevance. Infrastructure projects once viewed as speculative suddenly appeared visionary. Africa observed closely. Many African countries had maintained a careful silence on Somaliland, wary of setting precedents that could complicate internal borders elsewhere on the continent. Israel's move forced reconsideration. If recognition could be grounded in stability, governance, and functionality rather than inherited diplomatic inertia, then old assumptions deserved scrutiny. The European Union reacted cautiously. Statements emphasized dialogue, regional stability, and respect for existing frameworks. Yet behind the language, analysts recognized the disruption. A new actor had entered the formal diplomatic arena without passing through traditional approval channels. Israel framed the decision pragmatically. Recognition was described as an acknowledgement of reality rather than a provocation. Cooperation agreements followed swiftly, focusing on trade, agriculture, technology, and security coordination. These were not symbolic gestures, they were operational. Somaliland's leadership responded with measured confidence. There were no grand declarations of victory. Instead, emphasis remained on continuity, stability, and international engagement. Recognition was presented not as an endpoint, but as a foundation for further integration. On one hand, it supported democratic governance and stability. On the other, it faced the uncomfortable realization that its role as gatekeeper was no longer absolute. The disbelief stemmed less from opposition and more from surprise. Regional dynamics shifted subtly. Countries bordering the Red Sea assessed their positions. Diplomatic channels activated quietly. Trade corridors were re-evaluated. The idea that Somaliland could remain indefinitely unrecognized lost credibility. Africa's broader geopolitical posture evolved. The continent had increasingly asserted agency in global affairs, from trade to security to diplomacy. This moment reinforced that trend. External recognition no longer flowed exclusively through traditional power centers. By strengthening ties along critical maritime routes, it diversified strategic partnerships and reduced over-reliance on established corridors. This diversification mirrored broader global patterns where resilience replaced exclusivity. Global markets took note. Risk assessments shifted as political legitimacy altered economic expectations. Somaliland's case exposed the tension between principle and practice. Israel's decision tilted the balance toward pragmatism. Washington's disbelief transformed into reassessment. Policy analysts debated implications. Should the United States adapt to emerging realities or attempt to reinforce traditional processes? The question extended beyond Somaliland. It touched on the future of diplomatic influence itself. Africa's response remained diverse. Recognition by a technologically advanced and diplomatically active state carried weight. It signaled that engagement could proceed without universal consensus. The Red Sea corridor emerged as a focal point. Security cooperation, trade facilitation, and infrastructure development converged. Somaliland's ports gained strategic value not just regionally but globally. The territory's long-standing emphasis on self-reliance suddenly aligned with international interest. Israel's move set a precedent without declaring one by avoiding ideological framing. It reduced immediate backlash while still reshaping the diplomatic map. Recognition was framed as bilateral, but its implications were multilateral. As the first phase of reaction settled, one reality stood clear. The global system was adjusting to a world where recognition, legitimacy, and partnership were increasingly driven by functionality rather than formality. Somaliland's recognition marked not just a diplomatic event, but a signal of changing rules. And for the United States, the disbelief was less about the act itself and more about what it revealed. Influence was no longer guaranteed by tradition alone. In a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape, decisions could emerge from unexpected quarters, redefining alliances and assumptions overnight. Unfolded beyond the initial shock of recognition and into the machinery of regional and global politics. Once Israel's decision moved from announcement to implementation, its implications spread outward, touching alliances, trade routes, and long-standing diplomatic habits that had shaped engagement with the Horn of Africa for decades. Somaliland's new status altered conversations immediately. Diplomatic missions that had once limited contact to informal channels began reassessing their positions. Language in official documents shifted subtly, replacing ambiguity with specificity. Trade delegations arrived under the banner of exploration, but their agendas were concrete: port access, logistics hubs, digital infrastructure, and agricultural cooperation. The Red Sea corridor took on renewed urgency. This narrow stretch of water had always been strategically important, but recognition changed the calculus. Somaliland's coastline, once treated as peripheral, now appeared central to maritime security and commercial routing. Shipping insurers revised risk assessments. Logistics firms adjusted long-term plans. What had been a quiet coastline gained geopolitical weight. Africa's internal debate intensified. Some countries emphasized the principle of territorial integrity, cautious about precedents. Others pointed to Somaliland's decades of self-governance, stability, and institutional continuity. The tension between inherited borders and lived reality, long present but rarely confronted directly, surfaced more openly. Regional organizations found themselves under pressure. Existing frameworks had avoided definitive positions, preferring neutrality. Israel's move forced reassessment. Silence now carried interpretation, engagement. Even limited became a statement. Somaliland leveraged the moment carefully. Rather than demanding immediate recognition from others, it focused on functionality. Trade facilitation agreements advanced, port modernization accelerated, regulatory frameworks aligned with international standards. The objective was to make engagement practical, not ideological. Israel deepened cooperation methodically. Technology transfer programs focused on water management and agriculture. Security coordination emphasized maritime awareness rather than militarization. Economic ties prioritized scalability. Each initiative reinforced the perception that recognition was not symbolic but operational. The United States recalibrated quietly. Public statements remained measured, emphasizing stability and dialogue. Behind closed doors, policy reviews examined the implications for regional influence. The realization settled that influence could no longer be exercised solely through gatekeeping recognition. Engagement required adaptability. European responses diverged. Some countries explored technical cooperation without formal recognition, testing boundaries. Others maintained distance, citing established processes. Yet even restraint acknowledged change. The question was no longer whether Somaliland existed, but how to interact with it. China observed without immediate action. Its approach favored patience and leverage through infrastructure and trade rather than diplomatic declarations. Port access, logistics corridors, and investment feasibility were assessed pragmatically. Recognition was not dismissed, but deferred until alignment with broader strategy became clear. The Middle East adjusted perceptions. States with interests along the Red Sea monitored developments closely. Security considerations intersected with trade ambitions. Somaliland's ports offered alternatives that reduced congestion and vulnerability elsewhere. Quiet engagement increased. Somaliland's domestic narrative evolved. Recognition validated long-held claims, but leaders emphasized responsibility over triumph. International scrutiny intensified expectations. Governance standards, transparency, and stability became even more critical. Legitimacy now had to be maintained, not just asserted. Economic implications multiplied. Foreign investors who had previously hesitated due to political ambiguity revisited projects. Financing costs adjusted downward as risk perceptions shifted. Employment prospects expanded around logistics, services, and construction. Africa's broader geopolitical posture shifted incrementally. The episode reinforced a growing sense that agency mattered. External actors were no longer the sole arbiters of legitimacy. Stability, governance, and strategic relevance could reshape diplomatic outcomes. Israel's decision influenced discourse far beyond Somaliland. Analysts debated whether functionality should outweigh formal recognition frameworks. The precedent was not declared, but the example lingered. Other regions with unresolved status questions took note, as did states navigating similar dilemmas. The United States faced a strategic inflection. The disbelief that followed the announcement matured into reflection. Influence would increasingly depend on engagement quality rather than procedural control. Adaptation became a necessity, not a concession. Security cooperation along the Red Sea evolved, information sharing improved, maritime monitoring expanded. The emphasis remained preventive rather than provocative. Stability, not escalation, became the shared interest. Somaliland's ports emerged as test cases. Efficiency gains, transparency measures, and regulatory clarity were closely watched. Success would reinforce legitimacy more effectively than diplomatic argument. Failure would invite renewed skepticism. International institutions responded cautiously. Engagement took technical forms, development programs, humanitarian coordination, capacity building. Formal recognition remained absent, but functional cooperation increased, blurring old distinctions. The recognition reshaped timelines. What had once seemed indefinitely postponed now appeared inevitable to some observers. The question shifted from if to when and under what conditions. Africa's youth watched closely. For many, the episode symbolized possibility. Stability and self-governance could yield international engagement, even without traditional approval. The message resonated beyond borders. Israel consolidated its position. By acting decisively yet pragmatically, it expanded diplomatic reach and strategic options. The move aligned with a broader trend toward diversified partnerships across Africa and beyond. Global narratives adjusted. Commentary moved from surprise to analysis. Recognition was no longer framed as an anomaly, but as part of a changing diplomatic landscape where flexibility and interest increasingly guided decisions. As the second phase settled, the contours of a new reality emerged. Recognition had not triggered chaos. Borders had not unraveled. Instead, engagement intensified, debates matured, and assumptions shifted. Somaliland's case demonstrated that diplomatic inertia could be challenged without immediate instability. For the United States and others accustomed to setting the pace, the lesson was clear. Influence in the modern era required responsiveness to emerging realities. Decisions could originate outside expected centers, reshaping alignments. Without waiting for consensus, the historic shift was not just about Somaliland. It was about a world adjusting to distributed power, pragmatic recognition, and partnerships built on function rather than form. And as this adjustment continued, the disbelief that greeted the announcement faded, replaced by a more sobering recognition. The rules of global diplomacy were evolving, and no single actor controlled their direction anymore.